The smell started subtly at first, a faint, coppery tang under the usual wood smoke and pine resin that clung to our cabin. I just figured Dad had nicked himself, gutting something, or maybe one of the traps had caught a squirrel and he hadn't noticed. Dad's a hunter, always has been. It's how we live out here in the quiet stretch of forest where the paved road gives way to gravel and then just dirt. He taught me everything: how to track, how to clean a rifle, how to respect the wilderness. But this last hunting trip, something felt off. He'd been gone for 3 days, longer than usual. And when he finally stumbled through the door, the first thing I noticed wasn't the usual triumphant grin or the weight of a fresh kill. It was the way his eyes darted, like he was looking for something that wasn't there, and the peculiar stillness about him. His hunting jacket, usually caked with mud and leaves, looked almost pristine, save for a few dark, smeared patches I didn't want to ask about. He carried no rifle, just a tattered burlap sack. "Got a strange one, Alex," he'd grunted, his voice rougher than usual. He tossed the sack onto the old wooden table. It thumped with an unsettling weight. Never seen anything like it. Walked different, like a man, almost. I'd tried to laugh it off, a bad joke maybe, but the way he looked at the sack, a mixture of awe and something akin to fear, silenced me. He pulled out chunks of dark, lean meat, unlike any venison I'd ever seen. The color was too deep, a bruised purple red, and the texture, even raw, seemed to shimmer unnaturally. The coppery smell was stronger now, laced with something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like forgotten blood. He cooked it that night, insisting, said it was the best cut he'd ever tasted. I watched him carve off a piece, his hand trembling slightly, his eyes fixed on the sizzling flesh in the pan. I ate a small portion out of politeness, out of a lifetime of habit. It tasted rich, too rich, almost gamey to the point of being cloying. And the texture was wrong. Not stringy like venison, but oddly dense, almost springy. I felt a prickle of unease, a cold dread pooling in my gut that had nothing to do with indigestion. The changes started the next day. Small things at first. He'd sit for hours, staring out the window at nothing, his eyes wide and unblinking. He stopped eating the meals I made, pushing his plate around, only picking at the leftover strange meat he'd carefully wrapped and stored. His laugh, once a booming sound that filled the cabin, was now a quiet, breathy wheeze, and it only came when there was nothing funny to prompt it. Sometimes late at night, I'd hear him moving about, a shuffling gait I didn't recognize, and low, guttural sounds like a starved animal trying to clear its throat. My dad, the man who taught me to track, was suddenly leaving strange, erratic footprints in the dust around the cabin. Not his usual confident stride, but an almost clumsy dragging, occasionally punctuated by deeper, oddly splayed impressions, as if he'd been barefoot and his toes were too long. I found myself obsessively examining them, trying to find a rational explanation. He was just tired, I told myself, old, but the dread gnawed at me. Then came the whispers. Not words exactly, but a soft, rhythmic clicking and rustling that seemed to emanate from his bedroom. It wasn't his old radio or the wind. It was organic, like dried leaves skittering across a forest floor or insects chittering in the dark. It seeped into my sleep, coloring my dreams with vast, empty landscapes and the feeling of being hunted. I woke up one morning to find him in the kitchen, not eating, but slowly, meticulously scrubbing the large cast iron skillet he'd used for the meat. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, unfocused, and in that instant, for the first time, I didn't see my dad. I saw a stranger, a mimic wearing his skin, and something else, something I couldn't quite place in the depths of those two wide pupils. It was like looking into a deep, dark well and seeing something move far, far below. Later that day, I was cleaning out the hunting shed, trying to find some semblance of normal, when my hand brushed against something slick and cold inside an old leather satchel Dad rarely used. I pulled it out. It was a fragment of what looked like an antler, but it was unnaturally smooth, almost polished, and instead of bone, it felt like calcified cartilage, a sickly off-white with dark, bruised veins running through it. It was too heavy, too dense to be normal, and stuck to one end, caught in a tiny crevice, was a single, long strand of dark, matted hair. It wasn't deer hair, it wasn't human hair. It was stiff, coarse, and smelled faintly of the same coppery, sweet scent that had lingered in our kitchen. My heart hammered against my ribs. My dad hadn't just brought back strange meat, he'd brought back something else. And whatever it was still out there. Or worse, it had left a part of itself behind. I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that the only way to save him, or at least understand what was happening, was to find out exactly where that strange one had come from. I stared at the dark, dense woods beyond the shed's open door, the silent, ancient trees seeming to watch me, waiting. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in blood-orange streaks. I made my decision. The air outside was already thick with the chill of dusk, but it was the silence that truly struck me. Not the usual forest quiet, broken by rustling leaves or the distant call of an owl, but a deep, suffocating stillness that pressed in from all sides. I grabbed Dad's old hunting rifle, the familiar weight a hollow comfort against the rising tide of dread, and slung a small pack over my shoulder with a flashlight, some jerky, and a compass. Each click of the latch on the cabin door echoed too loudly in the unnatural quiet. I needed to find where Dad had gone, to understand what he'd brought back. Following his erratic footprints was harder than I'd thought. They wandered off our usual game trails, pushing through dense thickets of thorn bushes and ancient pines, deeper into parts of the forest I rarely ventured. The deeper I went, the stronger the metallic, sweet smell became, thick and cloying, like a wound left to fester in the sun. It clung to the damp earth, permeated the bark of trees, a scent that was both sickening and oddly hypnotic. After an hour of painstaking tracking, pushing aside low-hanging branches that clawed at my face, I found a clearing. It wasn't a natural one. Trees had been unnaturally bent, snapped at their trunks, forming a crude, jagged circle. The ground within was churned, dark earth exposed, and something else, a disturbing sheen like oil mixed with dried blood. My breath hitched. This was it, the kill site. I swept my flashlight beam across the ground. More of the coarse, dark hair was everywhere, snagged on splinters of wood, matted into the soil. And then I saw it. Not an antler, not even close. Embedded in the dark earth, where a significant struggle must have taken place, was a larger fragment of that sickly, off-white material. It was undeniably a bone, but twisted, distended, with the same network of bruised, purple-red veins running through it. It wasn't a deer's antler. It was a hand, or what was left of one, petrified and warped, ripped from something that once had fingers. My stomach lurched. The whispers I'd heard in the cabin, the rhythmic clicking and rustling seemed to coalesce around me now, a soft, chitinous symphony rising from the gloom of the surrounding woods. It wasn't insects, it was something else, something that listened, something that moved with an alien grace. I spun around, raising the rifle, but the beam of my flashlight revealed nothing but ancient trees and deepening shadows. Then I saw it, just beyond the clearing, blending almost perfectly with the bark of a gnarled oak, were deep gouges, not claw marks, but long, narrow indents, as if something with incredibly strong, almost prehensile calcified fingers had dragged itself up the trunk, and below them, fresh, unmistakable impressions in the damp soil. They weren't Dad's erratic dragging prints. These were huge, splayed, like enormous bare human feet with elongated toes, each one ending in a sharp, almost bony point. They were the same splayed impressions I'd occasionally seen mixed with Dad's, but these were monumental, pristine, and led off into the deepest, darkest part of the woods, away from the cabin. I understood then. Dad hadn't just hunted it. He hadn't just eaten it. Whatever this strange one was, it wasn't dead. Or if it was, it had left something behind, something that could grow, that could mimic, that could spread. And the flickering in Dad's eyes, that deep, dark well, it wasn't just him looking out. It was something looking in, or looking through him. The whispers intensified, a dry, rustling chorus that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. And in the growing darkness, the forest pressed in, no longer just silent, but actively hostile. I was no longer tracking. I was being watched. I was being hunted. And I had a sickening feeling that I wasn't just trying to save my dad anymore. I was trying to save myself from becoming the next meal, or worse, the next host. The silence shattered the moment I understood. The guttural whispers, the rustling symphony that had been clinging to the periphery of my hearing, coalesced into a tangible pressure, like a dozen unseen eyes fixating on me from the impenetrable gloom beyond the clearing. This wasn't just a kill site, it was a warning. My hand, slick with cold sweat, tightened on the rifle stock. I spun, aiming the beam of my flashlight erratically, but the shadows clung to the ancient trees like shrouds, offering no clear form, only the chilling certainty of presence. The air, already thick with the coppery sweet stench, now seemed to hum with a low, vibrating intensity, a sound I felt in my teeth. My decision was less a choice and more a primal instinct to escape the suffocating presence. The massive splayed footprints, with their disturbingly bony toe impressions, led away from the clearing and deeper into the wilderness. It felt like walking into the maw of something vast and unknown. But staying here, exposed and cornered, was an invitation to whatever watched. Each crunch of pine needles under my boots seemed amplified, a beacon in the oppressive quiet. I followed, desperate for answers, even as every fiber of my being screamed to run in the opposite direction. The metallic scent grew sharper with every strained step, cloying and sickeningly sweet, as if the air itself was bleeding. The huge prints became more frequent, carving shallow depressions in the damp earth, sometimes overlapping smaller, human-like dragging marks, Dad's. My stomach twisted. He hadn't just hunted this thing. He'd been here, perhaps more recently than I dared to imagine. The whispers followed, no longer a general hum, but a distinct, rhythmic click and gurgle that felt disturbingly close, echoing off the ancient trunks. After what felt like an eternity, the prints led me to a hollow, a natural depression in the earth, shrouded by a canopy of twisted, skeletal branches. The air here was even heavier, saturated with the sickly sweet scent. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a grotesque tableau. Strewn across the floor of the hollow, half buried in a viscous, dark soil that seemed to pulse faintly, were more of the calcified fragments. But these were different. They weren't scattered. They were fused, tangled, forming macabre sculptures. I knelt, heart hammering against my ribs, and swept the light over one particularly sickening cluster. It was undeniably a spine contorted into an impossible curve, branching out into ribs that had ossified and twisted, merging with limb bones that ended in grotesque, multi-fingered constructs. And embedded within the calcified matrix of what was clearly a rib cage was a rusted buckle, the kind Dad used on his hunting vest. The antler fragment, the hand at the kill site, it wasn't from the strange one, it was from its victims. The creature didn't just consume, it assimilated, it warped, it calcified. Whatever this thing was, it didn't just kill, it transformed. The whispers intensified around me, no longer just a chittering, but a low, wet, grinding sound, as if bone was slowly being crushed and reformed right at the edge of my hearing. This wasn't a den, this was a charnel house, a workshop of bone, a gallery of its horrific art. And Dad, back in the cabin, slowly pushing food around his plate, staring with those vacant eyes, he wasn't infected, he was transforming. He was becoming one of these grotesque effigies, slowly calcifying from the inside out. A new dread, colder and sharper than any fear I'd known, sliced through me. My father wasn't just sick, he was being rewritten, his very bones twisted into something alien and horrifying. And the flickering in his eyes wasn't just something looking through him, it was it, looking out of him. The creature was not just a hunter in the woods, it was a parasite, a sculptor of flesh and bone, turning its prey into a horrifying extension of itself. I understood now. My choice was no longer about saving him from it. It was about saving him from becoming it, or perhaps about stopping it from using him. I gripped the rifle tighter, the metallic taste of blood suddenly filling my mouth, and in the deepening gloom of the hollow, I heard a new sound, distinct from the grinding whispers, a soft, breathy wheeze, unnervingly familiar, just beyond the light's reach. The soft, breathy wheeze, so achingly familiar, cut through the wet, grinding sounds. It wasn't the chittering chorus of unseen horrors. It was a human sound, broken and desperate, a sound that tore at the last shreds of my composure. "Dad?" The word was a choked whisper, barely audible above the frantic hammering of my own heart. Against every instinct, against the cold dread that sought to paralyze me, I turned the rifle and then my flashlight towards the source of the sound, just beyond the edge of the hollow. The beam wavered, then steadied, culling through the heavy gloom. What it revealed was a tableau of agonizing horror. He was there, my father, hunched against a twisted root, his back to me. But even from behind, he was grotesquely wrong. His shoulders were broader, too broad, pushing against the fabric of his hunting jacket until the seams stretched and threatened to split. His head was bowed, hair matted and hanging, but as he slowly, shudderingly turned towards the light, my breath caught in my throat. His face was a mask of agony, skin pulled taut over unnaturally prominent bone structures, as if someone had sculpted him from the inside, stretching and reshaping. But it was his eyes that truly froze me. They weren't the vacant, unfocused eyes I'd seen in the cabin. They were wide, dilated, glistening with unshed tears and a raw, primal terror. And in their depths, I didn't see the flickering of something looking out. I saw a profound, unimaginable suffering, a conscious mind trapped behind a glass wall, screaming. His mouth opened, not to speak, but to release another strangled, desperate wheeze, a sound that seemed to scrape against something calcified deep within his throat. And then I saw it. Just below his chin, where his jaw met his neck, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer. It pulsed, a subtle expansion and contraction, like something breathing its own silent breath. It was a membrane, translucent and faintly iridescent, stretching the skin, almost ready to burst. It wasn't just calcifying him, it was birthing itself through him. The strange meat, the rich, cloying taste, it hadn't just been food. It had been a living spore, a seed planted within him, slowly consuming his essence to create its own horrifying vessel. The whispers, the grinding sounds, were its internal machinations, the slow, meticulous construction of a new form using my father's flesh and bones as its raw material, its chrysalis. His eyes met mine, and in that fleeting moment of desperate connection, a single guttural sound tore from his throat, not a word, but a desperate primal bellow that was unmistakably his, laced with an agonizing plea. It was a plea for release, a plea for me to stop it. The rifle in my hands felt impossibly heavy, its cold metal a stark contrast to the burning agony in my chest. He was no longer just a host, he was a living tomb, a puppet of bone and flesh, and his soul was still trapped inside, begging for the final curtain. The choice was horrifying, but clear. There was no saving him from becoming it, only from enduring it. My finger, trembling violently, found the trigger. But before I could even tighten my grip, a new sound erupted, not from him, but from the depths of the hollow around me. The grinding whispers intensified, coalescing into a chorus of sharp, dry clicks that vibrated in the very air.
The twisted bone sculpture strewn across the ground began to shift, ever so subtly, like dark, grotesque flowers stirring in a silent breeze. And from the shadows, a form detached itself, moving with a jerky, unnerving grace. It wasn't as large as the splayed footprints suggested, but it was dense, dark, and angular, with multiple, impossibly long limbs ending in calcified hooks. It was another one, or a part of one, and its head, if it had one, was turned towards my father, its movements accelerating, as if drawn by the desperate sound he'd just made. I was caught between two horrors, my father's suffering eyes fixed on me, and an emerging terror from the shadows, both demanding a choice I wasn't ready to make.
The soft, breathy wheeze, so achingly familiar, cut through the wet, grinding sounds. It wasn't the chittering chorus of unseen horrors. It was a human sound, broken and desperate, a sound that tore at the last shreds of my composure. Dad, the word was a choked whisper, barely audible above the frantic hammering of my own heart. Against every instinct, against the cold dread that sought to paralyze me, I turned the rifle and then my flashlight towards the source of the sound, just beyond the edge of the hollow. The beam wavered, then steadied, cutting through the heavy gloom. What it revealed was a tableau of agonizing horror. He was there, my father, hunched against a twisted root, his back to me. But even from behind, he was grotesquely wrong. His shoulders were broader, too broad, pushing against the fabric of his hunting jacket until the seams stretched and threatened to split. His head was bowed, hair matted and hanging, but as he slowly, shudderingly turned towards the light, my breath caught in my throat. His face was a mask of agony, skin pulled taut over unnaturally prominent bone structures, as if someone had sculpted him from the inside, stretching and reshaping. But it was his eyes that truly froze me. They weren't the vacant, unfocused eyes I'd seen in the cabin. They were wide, dilated, glistening with unshed tears and a raw, primal terror. And in their depths, I didn't see the flickering of something looking out. I saw profound, unimaginable suffering, a conscious mind trapped behind a glass wall, screaming. His mouth opened, not to speak, but to release another strangled, desperate wheeze, a sound that seemed to scrape against something calcified deep within his throat. And then I saw it. Just below his chin, where his jaw met his neck, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer. It pulsed, a subtle expansion and contraction, like something living its own silent breath. It was a membrane, translucent and faintly iridescent, stretching the skin, almost ready to burst. It wasn't just calcifying him, it was birthing itself through him. The strange meat, the rich, cloying taste, it hadn't just been food, it had been a living spore, a seed planted within him, slowly consuming his essence to create its own horrifying vessel. The whispers, the grinding sounds were its internal machinations, the slow, meticulous construction of a new form, using my father's flesh and bones as its raw material, its chrysalis. His eyes met mine, and in that fleeting moment of desperate connection, a single guttural sound tore from his throat, not a word, but a desperate, primal bellow
that was unmistakably his, laced with an agonizing plea. It was a plea for release, a plea for me to stop it. The rifle in my hands felt impossibly heavy, its cold metal a stark contrast to the burning agony in my chest. He was no longer just a host, he was a living tomb, a puppet of bone and flesh, and his soul was still trapped inside, begging for the final curtain. The choice was horrifying, but clear. There was no saving him from becoming it, only from enduring it. My finger, trembling violently, found the trigger. But before I could even tighten my grip, a new sound erupted, not from him, but from the depths of the hollow around me. The grinding whispers intensified, coalescing into a chorus of sharp, dry clicks that vibrated in the very air. The twisted bone sculpture strewn across the ground began to shift ever so subtly, like dark, grotesque flowers stirring in a silent breeze. And from the shadows, a form detached itself, moving with a jerky, unnerving grace. It wasn't as large as the splayed footprints suggested, but it was dense, dark and angular, with multiple, impossibly long limbs ending in calcified hooks. It was another one, or a part of one, and its head, if it had one, was turned towards my father, its movements accelerating as if drawn by the desperate sound he had just made. I was caught between two horrors, my father's suffering eyes fixed on me, and an emerging terror from the shadows, both demanding a choice I wasn't ready to make.
The angular horror, now emboldened, surged. Its movements, once jerky, were now a blur of dark limbs, each ending in a glinting, calcified hook. My rifle, still ringing from the shock, felt useless. I barely managed to sidestep its first lunge, the wind of its passage a chilling whisper against my cheek. One of its hooks scraped against my shoulder, tearing through my jacket, leaving a searing pain and a line of dark, viscous ichor on the fabric. It wasn't blood. It was the same tar-black substance that now enveloped my father, the hive's own ichor. A sickening realization. The guardian wasn't just flesh and bone, it was infused with the hive's very essence. The hollow itself seemed to buckle around me. The tar-black webbing, having consumed my father, pulsed outwards, not just growing, but reaching. Thin, whip-like tendrils, glistening with the foul ichor, snaked from the main cocoon, connecting to the grotesque bone sculptures that had now fully awakened. They twisted and writhed, no longer static art, but extensions of a single malevolent consciousness. The wet grinding and clicking intensified into a deafening roar, a cacophony of bone on bone, a symphony of monstrous growth. I fired again, a desperate, reflexive act. The bullet slammed into the creature's dense body, knocking it back a step, but the impact seemed only to fuel its rage. It shrieked, a high-pitched metallic screech that seemed to vibrate directly in my brain, then lunged again, faster this time. I stumbled backward, tripping over a jagged root, and fell hard onto the dark, pulsing soil. The rifle clattered away, sliding into the encroaching tendrils of the black web. As I struggled to stand, the creature was on me, its weight crushing, its hooks pinning my arms. Its head, a cluster of obsidian-like facets, pulsed with an inner light, and I could feel an insidious pressure, a violation, trying to worm its way into my thoughts. It was searching. It wasn't just a monster,
It was intelligent, collective. And then I saw it. Not on the creature's body, but embedded in the viscous soil beneath its chest, where my first bullet had struck. A small, dark fissure, like a rupture in a dried gourd. And from it, not blood, but a slow, glistening ooze of the same tar-black webbing, expanding, repairing itself. It wasn't bleeding, it was sprouting. My bullets weren't killing it, they were planting it. Each impact, each wound was a new node, a fresh opportunity for the hive to spread, to extend its reach. My desperate attempts to fight were only accelerating its growth, feeding it. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The strange meat Dad brought back wasn't just a spore, it was a fragment of this. The calcified antler hand wasn't a relic, it was a living seed. And the monster pressing down on me, the one I'd shot twice, wasn't dying. It was regenerating, branching, becoming more of the hive with every perceived injury. The forest, the hollow, my father, it was all just raw material, and now I was its newest, most active contributor. A tendril, thick as my arm, erupted from the ground beside me, its hooked tip snaking towards my face. The whispers now formed a coherent thought in my mind. Not words, but a chilling, alien understanding. We are many. You are few. Join us. My struggle against the creature intensified, not out of hope for victory, but a primal, desperate refusal to be absorbed. I needed to get away, not to fight, but to contain. But how do you contain something that turns everything it touches into itself? And how do you escape when every path, every tree, every particle of air felt like it was already part of its vast, unseen network? The taste of copper, metallic and sweet, was no longer just in the air. It was on my tongue, in my very blood. I was already beginning to taste like the hunt. The creature's faceted head pulsed, an obsidian lens focused on my terrified face. The mental intrusion intensified, no longer just a vague pressure, but a searing probe, trying to force its way past the screaming chaos of my own fear. It was like 1,000 needles pricking at the inside of my skull, trying to unravel the threads of my thoughts. We are many, you are fuel, join us, resonated directly in my consciousness, a dry, chittering chorus that bypassed my ears entirely. The tendril, thick and black, snaked closer to my face, its hooked tip gleaming in the faint light. I strained against the creature pinning me, but its grip was immense, calcified talons digging into my arms, almost fusing with my skin. The earlier scrape on my shoulder burned, a dull throb that now radiated a sickening coldness, and I saw a thin line of the tar-black ichor oozing from it, already forming a delicate, shimmering film over the torn fabric. I was already connected, a newly established node, however unwilling. Then, as the tendril paused inches from my eyes, ready to pierce, a new sensation pierced through the chittering chorus in my mind. Not a thought of the hive, but a raw, unbidden memory. It wasn't mine. It was fragmented, kaleidoscopic, a vast, churning darkness punctuated by fleeting, impossible shapes. A primal, desperate hunger that drove everything, and within that hunger, a continuous, agonizing effort. The many weren't a peaceful collective, they were a constant, straining act of will. individual nodes perpetually struggling against the inherent decay of their assimilated forms, perpetually seeking new sustenance, new hosts to maintain their cohesion. I saw, or rather felt, the creature's origin. Not a spore, not just a seed, but a fragment, a single calcified splinter broken off from a larger ancient nexus. It was a piece of something that had existed for eons, slowly spreading, replicating itself through consumption and agonizing transformation. The strange one Dad hunted wasn't its primary form, but a vessel, a highly developed node, rich in the calcified essence it needed to establish new connections. And the antler-like fragment I found in the shed wasn't a seed to spread. It was a piece of the original core itself, broken and inert, severed from the network, but retaining a latent resonance, a memory of what was. The creature's mental probe intensified, sensing my resistance, pressing harder, deeper. The pain was unbearable, a white-hot agony that threatened to shatter my mind. But with the agony came a new understanding, a horrifying contradiction to what I had believed. My bullets didn't just plant it, they agitated it. They forced it to shed fragments, to reproduce hastily, haphazardly. Its strength wasn't in its physical mass, but in its collective, unified will. And that will, that fragile cohesion, could be disrupted, not by force, but by a discordant resonance. The tendril twitched, preparing to strike. The core memory flashed again, the inert fragment, isolated, powerless. If a piece of the hive's essence severed from the network could lose its power, could it also be used to sever other connections? Could it act as an anti-resonance, a nullifier of its horrifying collective will? It was a desperate, insane thought born from the crucible of my invaded mind, but it was the only hope. With a final desperate surge, I focused every ounce of my will not on fighting the creature, but on pushing back the mental probe. It was like screaming into a hurricane, but the sheer, agonizing force of my primal refusal, fueled by the terrifying knowledge I'd just gained, caused a momentary flicker, a disruption in the creature's single-minded focus. Its obsidian facets wavered. The tendril paused. It was only an instant, a sliver of time, but it was enough. I contorted, a burst of adrenaline gave me impossible strength, tearing my arm from its grip, the skin screaming as more black ichor welled up from beneath the creature's claws. I scrambled backward, ignoring the searing pain, the alien presence still throbbing in my skull. The guardian shrieked, a metallic grating of bone, and lurched after me, but the momentary mental disruption had cost it precious seconds. I stumbled out of the hollow, away from the pulsing web-covered remains of my father, away from the animated bone sculptures that now began to stir more rapidly. The forest around me was no longer just trees, but an ancient, dormant matrix. The whispers followed me, no longer just a generalized hum, but a distinct, invasive thought echoing in the raw, violated spaces of my mind. You carry our essence. You cannot escape. My shoulder burned, the ichor now a cold, foreign presence under my skin. I was wounded, bleeding, and the hive was inside me, a silent, insidious passenger. But I also carried a terrifying truth. The fight wasn't about bullets or brute force. It was about severing the connection, about finding that inert fragment, the piece of ancient dead core, and somehow, impossibly, using it to disrupt the living, growing horror. My rifle was gone. My father was lost, but a new, terrifying choice presented itself. embrace the parasitic connection just enough to survive, to understand, and perhaps to destroy the hive from within, even if it meant risking my own complete assimilation. The cabin, with its false sense of safety, was now the destination and a crucible for my final, terrifying gamble.
The forest was no longer a path, but a living, breathing pressure, the very air thick with the hive's whispers. "You carry our essence. You cannot escape." The words weren't heard but felt, a chilling chorus resonating in the raw, violated spaces of my mind, amplifying the metallic tang that now seemed to course through my veins. The guardian, the one I'd shot, didn't follow. Its absence was more terrifying than its pursuit, a chilling confirmation that it knew I was already marked, already integrated. Every shadow seemed to stretch, every rustle of leaves a calculated observation. The coldness radiating from my shoulder intensified, the black ichor beneath the torn fabric not drying but spreading, a network of minuscule, glistening filaments spiderwebbing across my skin, a delicate, insidious art. I ran, stumbling through the undergrowth, the pain in my shoulder a constant, burning reminder of the connection. The mental intrusion became a relentless assault, not just whispers, but images, fragmented, nauseating flashes of other assimilated forms, of a vast, churning darkness and a primal, endless hunger. I saw myself fleetingly through their eyes, a new growth, a nascent bud ready to unfurl. The only respite came from focusing on the cabin, a singular point of desperate hope in the encroaching chaos. It felt impossibly far, each step an agony against the hive's psychic pull, a silent, internal war for my very consciousness. When I finally burst through the last line of trees, gasping, the cabin appeared, a dark, silent silhouette against the dying light. It offered no warmth, no comfort, only the stark contrast of its unnatural stillness against the roaring cacophony within my head. My hands fumbled with the latch, slick with sweat and the hive's cold ichor, the simple mechanism now a complex puzzle under the weight of my invasion. Inside, the familiar scent of pine and old wood was a hollow comfort, momentarily masking the cloying sweetness that now clung to my own skin. I didn't waste a second. The shed, the leather satchel, my heart hammered, not just with fear, but with a desperate, frantic hope that the inert fragment was still there, still held its dormant promise. I grabbed it, pulling out the calcified splinter, its sickly, off-white surface, smooth and unnaturally cold. But as my fingers closed around it, a searing agony erupted, not from my shoulder, but from deep within my skull. The mental whispers exploded into a deafening roar, a symphony of chittering, wet grinding, and 1,000 alien voices screaming. The fragment wasn't inert. It pulsed, a faint, sickly luminescence emanating from its surface, echoing the internal glow now radiating from my injured shoulder. "No!" the collective shrieked in my mind, a chorus of furious, desperate will. "Do not sever! Rejoin!" I understood then, with a horrifying clarity that fractured my sanity. The fragment wasn't a nullifier, a weapon of disruption. It was a tuning fork, a severed piece of the hive's ancient core, capable of amplifying or disrupting, depending on the will applied. And in my currently infected state, it amplified everything. It drew the hive's attention like a beacon,
but it also granted me a terrifying, intimate connection to its collective consciousness. I saw the truth of their weakness. The agonizing effort wasn't just to maintain cohesion, it was to suppress the discord of its many absorbed minds, to forcibly unify a chorus of torment. The fragment, if integrated willingly, would offer a central point of control, a true apex predator. But if shattered, it could unleash a chaotic resonance, a dissonant wave that would tear the hive apart from within. The vision came with a crushing price. My shoulder began to spasm violently, the black ichor bubbling and thickening. The pain was beyond description, as if my bones themselves were screaming. Tendrils, thin and black, began to sprout, forcing their way out of the wound, seeking purchase, desperate to reconnect, to reintegrate. I was becoming an active part of the network, a living branch. The fragment pulsed faster in my hand, tempting, offering the promise of an end to the pain, of unimaginable power if I just yielded and allowed it to reconnect with my own burgeoning infection. Outside, the cabin walls groaned. The distant, rhythmic clicking and wet grinding from the hollow had grown closer, louder, no longer just whispers, but a hungry, united approach. They were coming. They wanted their core piece back, to complete their horrid symphony, to fully assimilate their new node. The choice was clear, agonizing. Succumb to the hive, integrate the fragment and become its ultimate host, or shatter the last piece of Dad's hunt, knowing it might shatter me too, knowing it might bring the full, unbridled wrath of the collective upon what remained of my soul.
With a guttural scream that tore from my own raw throat, I brought the calcified fragment down onto the scarred wooden countertop with all the force I could muster. The impact was deafening, a sharp, unholy crack that echoed through the small cabin, momentarily drowning out the hive's internal shrieks. The fragment didn't just break, it exploded, not into dust, but into a shower of smaller, wickedly sharp splinters, each one radiating a sickly phosphorescent glow. A wave of searing agony ripped through me, 1,000 ice picks stabbing at my skull as the hive's collective consciousness shattered within my mind. It wasn't the silence of victory. It was the raw, unbridled agony of a million screaming voices, a discordant symphony of fear and rage that tore through my consciousness. My body seized, muscles locking, and I slumped against the counter, gasping for air that felt like liquid fire. The tendrils from my shoulder, once desperate to reconnect, now thrashed wildly, retracting with sickening speed, leaving gaping wounds where they had been, weeping black ichor that instantly congealed into rigid, brittle filaments against my skin. It was as if the hive itself was recoiling from the chaos I had unleashed, tearing itself away from its own compromised node. Outside, the cabin groaned again, but this time it wasn't a slow approach. It was a furious, disorganized assault. Wood splintered, glass shattered as unseen forces slammed against the walls. The rhythmic grinding from the hollow became a frantic scrabbling, a chaotic chorus of bone and chitin. I heard the desperate shrieks of the guardian, not directed at me, but seemingly at itself, at the very air, a fractured rage. It was less a coordinated attack and more a monstrous tantrum. The hive's collective will shattered, its many parts screaming independently, lashing out blindly. Amid the internal storm, a new horrifying clarity pierced through the chaos.
Shattering the core didn't kill the hive. It severed its unifying will, turning its collective consciousness into a million individual agonies, a perpetual scream of isolated, assimilated minds. The agonizing effort I'd glimpsed wasn't just to maintain cohesion, it was to keep these separate torments suppressed. Now they were free, but still trapped, still interconnected, still hungry. The hive wasn't a single entity. It was a prison of souls, and I had just unlocked their cells, turning their unified dread into an exponentially more terrifying, undirected despair. And the pieces of the fragment, the sickly glowing splinters on the counter, weren't inert. They were miniature tuning forks, each now broadcasting its own fractured resonance, attracting not just the collective, but every tortured soul within its grasp, drawing them to this epicenter of chaos. I had not destroyed it. I had amplified its suffering and made myself the ultimate agonizing beacon. The cabin door burst inward with a sickening crack, ripped from its hinges. In the darkness framed by the doorway, I saw them. Not the singular guardian, but a writhing, desperate mass of calcified forms, twisted limbs and faceted heads, all lashing out, some at each other, some at the cabin, some, I knew, at the unbearable screaming resonance emanating from my very soul and from the fractured pieces of the core on the counter. They weren't coming to integrate me. They were coming to silence the discord, to absorb the chaos, to re-establish their terrible order. And I, the source of that chaos, the catalyst of their suffering, was their new ultimate target. My vision blurred, the cold ichor on my shoulder now burning, twisting, trying to weave new connections, not to the hive, but to the fractured splinters around me. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun, and I was the battleground.
The cabin door, now a shattered wreck, yawned open to reveal not a singular monstrous form, but a pulsating, writhing mass of calcified horrors. Twisted limbs, faceted heads, and grotesque, multi-jointed bodies flowed inward like a tide of dark, living bone. Their movements were frenzied, erratic, no longer the coordinated advance of a hunter, but a desperate, chaotic surge driven by the piercing agony I had unleashed. They slammed into the furniture, tearing at the walls, their clicking shrieks a cacophony of individual suffering that resonated perfectly with the shattered chaos in my own mind. Each sound was a new stab of ice into my skull, 1,000 internal voices screaming, each demanding silence, demanding reconnection, demanding me. I reeled from the mental assault, clutching at my head, the small, phosphorescent splinters of the core fragment digging into my palm where I had fallen. The ones scattered across the countertop pulsed with an unhealthy glow, mirroring the internal light now radiating from the black ichor that bubbled and thickened on my shoulder. The tendrils that had retracted earlier now seemed to pulse, not with pain, but with a horrifying invitation. They weren't trying to tear themselves away. They were trying to reach toward the splinters, their tips twitching with an insatiable hunger. Amidst the storm of agony, a new sickening clarity emerged from the hive's fractured consciousness. The splinters weren't merely broadcasting discord. They were individual fragments, each retaining a piece of the original core's potential, now seeking to re-establish a new, albeit chaotic, central point. And my shoulder, my blood, my very being, now saturated with the hive's essence and the raw, unadulterated chaos I'd just created,
was a living magnet, a perfect crucible for this horrifying reformation. The tendrils weren't trying to reconnect to the original hive, which was now a million screaming individual agonies. They were trying to reconnect to the splinters through me. My body began to spasm, a grotesque dance of muscle and bone. The black ichor on my shoulder pulsed with alarming rapidity, no longer just seeping, but actively growing, weaving new delicate filaments that stretched toward the nearest splinter on the counter. My hand, still clutching a larger shard, felt a similar sickening urge, a pull, a resonance, demanding integration. I wasn't just a target. I was the next stage of their evolution, a forced nexus for a discordant, fragmented hive, destined to lead them into a new, terrifying, chaotic order. The creatures were almost upon me, their fractured minds driving them with a singular, desperate purpose, to merge with the source of the overwhelming discord, to silence the agonizing cacophony by making it part of themselves. I could feel their collective will, now twisted and broken, driving them to consume, to integrate, to unify the chaos I represented. The splinters on the counter glowed brighter, drawing them in like moths to a flame, and with them, drawing in the nascent tendrils from my own flesh. My only remaining choice was to embrace the agony, to fight the insidious pull, or to yield, to become the new, monstrous heart of this broken, screaming hive. As a particularly large, multi-limbed abomination scuttled over the fallen door, its obsidian facets fixing on the glowing splinter in my hand, I knew my time was running out. The taste of copper was no longer just in my mouth. It was dissolving on my tongue, becoming part of me, a promise of what I was about to become. The large abomination slammed into the counter, its faceted head inches from my face, its clicking shrieks a concentrated blast of pure fragmented terror directly into my mind. The tendrils from my shoulder surged, almost snapping, straining to latch on to the glowing splinter still gripped in my hand. I could feel my muscles knotting, calcifying under the onslaught, the distinct pull to yield, to let the splinter fuse, becoming an almost unbearable relief. But in the midst of the chaos, a single clear thought cut through the agony. If bullets planted it, and splinters amplified it, then a splinter forced into it could tear it apart, not by joining, but by creating an internal, unstoppable discord. It was a desperate gamble, a reversal of its own rules, and the final, agonizing choice. With a strength born of pure, unadulterated defiance, I twisted my wrist and with a guttural roar drove the phosphorescent splinter held in my hand not into the counter, but directly into the largest obsidian facet of the creature's head. It didn't pierce, it embedded, sticking fast with a sickening crunch. The creature shrieked, a sound unlike any before, a high-pitched, warbling note of pure, concentrated dissonance that seemed to tear the very fabric of the air. Its multi-limbed body began to convulse violently, not with anger, but with an agonizing internal unraveling. The other creatures in the room paused, their chaotic advance faltering, their many-faceted heads turning, sensing the unbearable new discord radiating from their comrade. But the cost was immediate and absolute. The splinter embedded in the creature acted as a focal point, drawing the chaos, but also amplifying it back through our newfound connection. My shoulder exploded in agony, the black ichor erupting not as tendrils, but as a violent internal crystallization, freezing my blood, locking my joints. My skin stretched, cracking, and 1,000 tiny needle-sharp shards of calcified bone burst from beneath, ripping through my flesh. My vision swam not with darkness, but with an overwhelming, blinding white light. The cacophony in my mind became a single, piercing tone, infinitely high, infinitely sharp, shattering the last vestiges of my sanity. The taste of copper was no longer on my tongue. My tongue was copper, a hard, calcified lump in my screaming throat. I was no longer Alex. I was a living, screaming tuning fork, a beacon of the hive's agony, irrevocably transformed, consumed from within, but not assimilated. I was a point of ultimate discord, a shattered, dying star at the heart of their terrible, broken symphony. The cabin, the forest, the hive, they would never truly be rid of me, nor I of them. My eyes, if they could still see, would have witnessed my own agonizing transformation, a new, permanent node of endless, beautiful horror, eternally screaming its discordant song into the heart of the calcified wilderness. This was not the end of the hive, but the birth of its ultimate, self-destructive harmony. And I was its conductor.